In 1955, two French locomotives hit 206 miles an hour, and an American camera plane sent to film the crash couldn't keep up with them. That record stood for 50 years. Meanwhile, German machines were secretly hauling freight through the Rockies. A British train was screaming down the tracks on warship engines, and Europe's greatest rail experiment was being laughed out of existence right before it quietly took over the world. These 10 legends, America never saw them coming. Number 10. The Swiss AT. Let's start in the mountains. In the late 1940s, the Swiss Federal Railways had a problem that no American railroad ever truly faced: the Gotthard. This is a route that doesn't just climb, it corkscrews, looping through spiral tunnels on gradients as steep as 26 per thousand, roughly 1 in 38. Switzerland needed a locomotive that could drag a 600-ton train up that wall of rock at 75 kilometers an hour and do it without stalling. The answer was the A66. The specification was drawn up in 1949, and the first prototype, numbered 11401, rolled out in 1952, followed by 11402 in early 1953. These two machines were tested mercilessly, running up to 900 kilometers a day on the Gotthard route. After engineers sorted out the wheel sets and the flanges, full production began, and between 1955 and 1966, a total of 120 were built. Here's the charming part that makes this locomotive so distinctly European. The first 25 A66s were each named after a Swiss canton and wore that canton's coat of arms, mounted proudly on the side of the body, with decorative chrome strips running along the flanks. They became known as the Cantons Locomotiven, the Canton Locomotives, and their naming was celebrated with actual public ceremonies in the towns they honored. Later machines were named after Swiss cities. With 6 powered axles and 4,300 kilowatts on tap, the A66 was the undisputed king of the Gotthard through the 1950s and 60s, hauling both express passengers and heavy freight. It only stepped aside when the far more powerful Re-66 arrived in the 1970s. To an American eye raised on diesels, the idea of a heavy freight hauler running on overhead wires through the Alps was almost science fiction. But for Switzerland, coal-poor and tunnel-heavy, electricity was simply the only sensible way to move mountains. Number 9. The Italian E444 Tartaruga, now to Italy, and one of the most delightfully contradictory machines on this entire list. By the mid-1960s, the world was watching Japan's Shinkansen and hearing whispers of a coming French high-speed revolution. Italy's proud fast trains, like the pre-war ETR 200, were aging, and the country needed to prove its industry could still build something genuinely quick. The result was the FS Class E444. 4 prototypes were built at the Savigliano Works and made their debut in 1967 and 1968. On the 8th of November 1967, the very first unit made a headline-grabbing run reaching over 200 kilometers per hour, making the E444 the first Italian electric locomotive designed for sustained 200-kilometer-an-hour running. Full production followed, and by 1975 there were 117 of them, forming the backbone of Italy's intercity and trans-Europe express services for decades. So why the nickname Tartaruga, which means tortoise? It came from a public naming competition, and in a wonderful stroke of Italian humor, the railway actually painted a little cartoon of a speeding tortoise on the sides of the cabs, a cheeky joke about a slow animal that could outrun almost anything on rails. The locomotive wore an elegant livery of pearl gray with blue stripes, and that smooth, rounded aerodynamic nose was so well regarded that it's widely credited with influencing the design of Germany's own express flagship, which we'll meet later in this video. The E444 was also Italy's rolling laboratory. In 1972, one unit became the first Italian locomotive to use electronic chopper control, boosting its power by around 25%. From 1989 onward, the whole class was rebuilt as the E444R, soldiering on for another 30 years. They finally bowed out of regular service around 2020, ending a career that spanned more than half a century. Americans who never had a 3,000-volt DC network humming above their main lines simply never encountered this smiling gray tortoise, one of the quiet pioneers that made Italian high-speed rail possible. Number 8. The Ludmilla. This one is a genuine Cold War time capsule. While the West poured its money into electrification, the countries of the Eastern Bloc largely bet on diesel, and East Germany's Deutsche Reichsbahn needed big, powerful diesels fast. But under the trade agreements of the Socialist Economic Bloc, East Germany wasn't allowed to build large diesel locomotives itself, so it bought them from the Soviet Union. Between 1972 and 1982, the October Revolution locomotive works in Lugansk, then Voroshilovgrad, in Soviet Ukraine, delivered a staggering 709 of these 6-axle diesel-electric giants to East Germany, nearly 21 meters long, powered by a 16-cylinder Kolomna engine, producing up to 2,940 kilowatts and capable of 140 kilometers an hour. They were monsters compared to most Western diesels of the day. The East German railway crews gave them a nickname that stuck forever: Ludmilla. The name apparently began at the maintenance depot in Leipzig, and to this day German rail fans use it with real affection for the whole family of machines. There was one early quirk that says everything about their Soviet origins. Because Russian passenger cars were heated individually, the first Ludmillas arrived with no electric train heating at all, so they could only pull freight until heating was fitted. Here's the part that makes them unforgettable. When the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified in 1990, the Ludmillas didn't disappear. The West German Railway, now Deutsche Bahn, actually valued them. They were powerful, tough, and reliable, and took them straight into the unified fleet, where many were re-engined and renumbered into classes 232, 233, 234, and 241. Soviet-built locomotives, designed for a communist state that no longer existed, kept thundering across a capitalist, reunified Germany well into the 21st century and beyond. A machine born of one world, still working hard in another. Almost no American ever knew these red and gray giants, hand-built in Ukraine, even existed. Number 7. The British Western. Now for a piece of beautiful British stubbornness. When British Railways launched its great modernization plan in the 1950s to sweep away steam, most of the country's new diesels followed the American formula, diesel-electric, where the engine drives a generator that powers electric motors. But one corner of Britain refused to follow the crowd. The Western region, heir to the proud Great Western Railway, looked instead to Germany. German engineers had perfected the diesel hydraulic locomotive, lighter, using a fluid transmission instead of heavy electrical gear, with an excellent power-to-weight ratio. The Western region loved the idea, and its flagship became the Class 52, universally known as the Western. 74 were built at Swindon and Crewe between 1961 and 1964. Each powered by two German-designed Maybach MD 655 engines, driving through Voith hydraulic transmissions, technology the Western region had been studying since the mid-1950s. And these machines had personality. Every single one carried a two-word name, beginning with Western. Western Enterprise, Western Champion, Western Hero, Western Fusilier. 74 names that became part of the everyday vocabulary of West Country railway travel. Crews nicknamed them the Wizzos and the Thousands after their D1000 series numbers. In striking liveries, including a memorable desert sand gold, they hauled the region's top expresses at up to 90 miles an hour. But being different came at a fatal cost. British Rail eventually decided that hydraulic transmissions were non-standard, too much trouble to maintain alongside a national fleet of diesel electrics. That decision was a death sentence. Despite being powerful, capable, and beloved, the entire Western fleet was withdrawn between 1973 and 1977, and the early demise of these hydraulics helped hasten the closure of historic Swindon Works itself. Yet the Westerns had such a devoted following that 7 were saved, and one, D1015 Western Champion, still runs on Britain's main line on charter trains today. It's a monument to a very European idea that Britain tried, loved, and then abandoned. Number 6. The German V200. To understand the Western, you have to meet its inspiration, and that means going to West Germany in the early 1950s, a country rebuilding itself from the rubble of war. The symbol of that recovery, on rails at least, was a sleek red diesel locomotive, the Deutsche Bundesbahn Class 5 200. Built by Krauss-Maffei of Munich, 5 prototypes rolled out starting in 1953, first shown at the Munich Transport Exhibition that year. Full production ran from 1956, and 86 were built in total. Under that curvaceous crimson body sat 2 V12 diesel engines from makers like Maybach and Mercedes-Benz, driving through a hydraulic transmission, good for 140 kilometers an hour. With its muscular yet elegant lines and the raised relief lettering along its flanks, the V200 came to embody the Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's post-war economic miracle. It swept away the sooty steam giants and pulled the nation's most prestigious first-class express trains, and a genuine legend was born. This locomotive was so respected that it became an export ambassador. In 1955, one V200 was driven under its own power all the way through Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey, partly as a test and partly as a traveling sales pitch to foreign railways. And its influence reached across the English Channel. Britain's warship-class diesel hydraulics were built under license from Krauss-Maffei, directly based on the V200's design, including that distinctive shape. But the deeper reason the V200 belongs on this list is what it started. It proved that a German diesel hydraulic could be fast, elegant, and reliable, and that reputation for hydraulic power is exactly what tempted engineers in Britain, and astonishingly, in America, to come knocking on Krauss-Maffei's door. The V200 is the ancestor of 2 of the most fascinating what-if stories in railway history, one of which put German engineering right in the heart of the American West, which brings us closer to the machines Americans really never saw coming. Number 5. The DB Class 103. Before we cross the Atlantic, one more German masterpiece, and this one is a titan. As West Germany's economy roared into the 1960s, the Bundesbahn wanted a locomotive to headline its glamorous new intercity and Trans-Europe Express network, something fast, powerful, and unmistakably modern. What it got was arguably the greatest express electric locomotive Europe ever built, the Class 103. 4 prototypes, originally designated E03, were unveiled at the Great International Transport Exhibition in Munich in 1965, where they hauled demonstration runs to Augsburg at 200 kilometers an hour on a regular basis. The engineers realized the prototypes needed even more muscle, so the production version, launched in 1970 and built through 1974, was beefed up considerably. In the end, 145 production machines were built, and the numbers are jaw-dropping even now. The production Class 103 delivered a continuous output of 7,440 kilowatts, nearly 10,000 horsepower, from a single locomotive. When it entered service, it was the most powerful single-unit electric locomotive in the world. It was designed to be capable of well over 250 kilometers an hour, though in normal service it was held to 200. In testing, individual units touched 280. Wrapped in that streamlined body, usually in a striking scarlet and cream TT livery or later traffic red, the Class 103 became the proud face of German express railways for 2 decades. It routinely hauled heavy first-class expresses across the country at a sustained 200 kilometers an hour. Years before the IC high-speed trains existed, it was one of the first German locomotives to use in-cab signaling, essential once you're traveling faster than a driver can safely read line-side signals. There was a catch that revealed just how hard it was pushed. Running flat out at those speeds, the Class 103 wore itself out. But few locomotives have ever combined raw power and sheer elegance so completely. To Americans, whose fastest passenger trains ran on diesel, a 10,000 horsepower electric express machine gliding along at 125 miles an hour in 1970 was simply beyond the horizon. Number 4. The British APT. Now for the most heartbreaking story on this list. A train that was decades ahead of its time, humiliated in public, and then vindicated in the most extraordinary way. The advanced passenger train. Britain's West Coast Main Line was fast but frustrating, full of Victorian-era curves that forced trains to slow down. British Rail's radical answer, developed through the 1970s, was a train that would actively tilt into the bends, leaning like a motorcyclist so it could take curves far faster without throwing passengers around. It was a genuinely revolutionary idea. The service prototype, the APT-P, also bristled with advanced technology, including hydrokinetic brakes, essentially water turbines, that let it stop from 155 miles an hour within existing signal distances, and it was blisteringly fast. On the 20th of December 1979, an APT set a British rail speed record of 162.2 miles an hour, 261 kilometers per hour, a national record that would stand for 23 years until a Eurostar finally broke it in the early 2000s. But the project was cursed by delays. It had been in development for over a decade, and by the time 3 prototype trains limped into passenger service, patience had run out. The public launch in 1981 was a disaster. Cold weather froze the tilt systems, journalists reported feeling queasy, and the newspapers gleefully branded the whole thing a fiasco. Under a government with little love for British rail, support collapsed. The trains ran for barely more than a year before being withdrawn, and plans for a production fleet were scrapped. The APT became a national punchline, Britain's great railway embarrassment. Except the story doesn't end there. The tilting technology British Rail had painstakingly developed was sold to the Italian firm Fiat Ferroviaria. The Italians solved the remaining problems and built it into a train you may have heard of, the Pendolino. Pendolinos went on to run successfully across Europe, and in the ultimate irony, Britain eventually bought that very technology back, and today, tilting Pendolinos run on the exact same West Coast main line the APT was built for. The failure had quietly won. Number 3. The Deltic. Now for a locomotive with a heart ripped straight out of the Royal Navy. Meet the British Rail Class 55, universally known as the Deltic. In the 1950s, British Railways needed something to replace steam on the East Coast Main Line, the great racetrack from London to Edinburgh. They needed enormous power, but at a weight light enough not to hammer the track to pieces. The solution came from an unlikely place, the sea. The Napier Company had developed an engine called the Deltic for fast naval patrol boats and minesweepers. It was extraordinary, 18 cylinders and 36 pistons arranged in 3 banks, forming a triangle, with no cylinder heads, no valves, and no camshafts. Combustion happened between pairs of opposed pistons. It was compact, ferociously powerful, and it screamed at up to 1,500 RPM. English Electric had a bold idea. Put 2 of these marine engines into a single locomotive. Each engine produced 1,650 horsepower for a combined 3,300, and when the Class 55 entered service in 1961, that made it the most powerful single-unit diesel locomotive in the world. Just 22 were built at the Vulcan Foundry, following a one-off prototype simply called Deltic that had demonstrated the concept back in 1955. For 20 years, these machines owned the East Coast Main Line, storming north from King's Cross to Leeds, Newcastle, and Edinburgh, routinely hitting 100 miles an hour. But it was the sound that made them immortal. That triangular 2-stroke engine produced a distinctive, wailing, unforgettable roar unlike anything else on rails, a mechanical drama that made grown railwaymen fall silent and turned the Deltic into perhaps the most celebrated British diesel of all time. Each was given a name, some after racehorses, others after British Army regiments, creating an emotional bond with the public that diesels rarely achieve. They were finally displaced by the intercity 125 high-speed trains and withdrawn in the early 1980s, but 6 were preserved. To think that the engine at the heart of Britain's most legendary locomotive was originally designed to power warships is the kind of story that sounds invented, but every word of it is true. Number 2. The Krauss-Maffei ML 4000. And now the one Americans really never knew, because it was hiding in plain sight on their own railroads. This is the story of how German locomotives ended up thundering through the mountains of California and Colorado. By the late 1950s, 2 great Western railroads, the Southern Pacific and the Denver and Rio Grande Western, were hungry for more power than American builders could offer. Typical U.S. diesels of the day made around 2,000 horsepower. Frustrated, both railroads did something almost unheard of. They went to Germany, to Krauss-Maffei, and asked them to build an Americanized version of their diesel hydraulics. The result was the ML 4000. After trials on Austria's fearsome Semmering incline in July 1961, 6 of these locomotives were shipped across the Atlantic and unloaded at the port of Houston on the 31st of October 1961, 3 for the Southern Pacific and 3 for the Rio Grande. Each packed 2 Maybach 516 engines and Voith hydraulic transmissions producing 3,540 horsepower, nearly double a typical American diesel of the era, a level US builders wouldn't match for years. Imagine the sight. Full-width car-body locomotives with high turret cabs and German-designed 3-axle trucks, unlike anything ever built in America, working freight through the Sierra Nevada and the Rockies. The Southern Pacific even built a special track at its Roseville shops just to service them. Railroaders gave them blunt nicknames, the Krauts, the Americalokes, but the American mountains destroyed them. The Rio Grande found them unsuitable on its steep grades and sold its 3 to the SP by 1964. On the heavy drag freights, the hydraulic transmissions overheated and burned out. The delicate Maybach engines were a maintenance nightmare. Some jobs required lifting the entire engine out of the locomotive. The Southern Pacific watched costs climb and pulled the plug, retiring its diesel hydraulics by 1968, barely 7 years after they arrived. Of roughly 21 that ran in North America, all but 1 were scrapped. A single former SP unit, number 9010, survives, lovingly preserved by the Pacific Locomotive Association. German engineering had come to conquer the American West, and the American West had won. Number 1. The SNCF Record Twins, and finally the machines that opened this video, and the ones that changed rail history forever. In 1955, France was quietly obsessed with a question: how fast could a train really go? Trials in 1954 had already pushed a French electric locomotive to 243 kilometers an hour with startling ease, and the engineers calculated the true limit might be over 320. So they decided to find out. They chose 2 locomotives. One was the CC7-107, built by Alstom. The other was the BB9004 from Jomont Schneider. And they picked a dead straight stretch of the Landes line in southwest France, between Fechure and Morseilles. On the 28th and 29th of March 1955, on 2 separate runs, these 2 locomotives were driven to a shattering 331 kilometers an hour, 206 miles an hour. It was a world rail speed record that would stand for over 50 years, unbroken until an Austrian locomotive finally topped it in September 2006. The runs were genuinely terrifying. At speed, the pantograph strip collecting power from the overhead wire shattered. On one run, the crew had to instantly raise a second pantograph. The overhead wire itself danced and whipped. The track was left distorted in places. These were single locomotives with just a handful of instrumented cars, running far beyond anything anyone had attempted before. And here's the detail from our hook, and it's true. The event was broadcast around the world, and an American television crew was so certain of catching a disaster that they sent an airplane to fly overhead and film the train, derailing before it reached 330. Instead, the aircraft had trouble keeping pace with the locomotive on the ground. The train they expected to crash simply outran the plane. The French railway, in a graceful move to protect the commercial interests of both manufacturers, credited the record jointly to both machines. And the data gathered from those 2 runs fed directly into decades of French high-speed development, the 200-kilometer-an-hour expresses of the 1960s, and ultimately the TGV itself. The record-breaking BB9004 survives today at the Cité du Train Museum in Mulhouse. 2 locomotives, one frozen March morning in 1955, and a moment when Europe glimpsed the future of rail, while an American film crew watched from the air and simply couldn't keep up. If there's a forgotten locomotive you think deserves the spotlight next, tell me in the comments. And if this trip through Europe's lost iron giants was worth the ride, you know what to do.